This film is for informational and educational purposes only. It does not aim to advertise, promote, or suggest any specific conduct. Case number 10, the empty safe. She told everyone she had saved a dying man on a train, an American millionaire, gasping for breath, rescued by a young Frenchwoman with smelling salts. In gratitude, he had left her a fortune. There was only one problem with the story. The man had never lived, and the fortune had never existed. Thérèse d'Aurignac was born in 1856 in Orson, a village near Toulouse, the daughter of Guillaume d'Aurignac, a foundling who spun grand fantasies of noble blood. He insisted the family name was truly d'Aurignac, that somewhere they owned a chateau, and that a heavy brass-studded chest in his keeping held the documents that would one day make them rich. He raised his children on that single promise, and Thérèse believed it longest of all. When her father died, the family opened the chest at last. There were no deeds, no titles, no gold. There was a single brick. The inheritance that had shaped her entire childhood was a lie, but Thérèse did not learn the lesson her father intended. She learned a different one entirely. She had watched a worthless object hold a family in thrall for years. The fiction had power as long as the lid stayed shut. That was the insight she carried into adulthood. People will believe in a treasure they cannot see, so long as they are never allowed to look inside. Working in service in a household tied to the Humbert family, she met Frédéric Humbert, son of Gustave Humbert, the mayor of Toulouse and a rising figure in French law who would one day become the nation's Minister of Justice. To win Frédéric, she invented her first inheritance, a fortune supposedly left to her by an elderly benefactress. When his father objected to the match, the young couple simply eloped to Paris, and Thérèse began her career of borrowed money and borrowed grandeur. In Paris, the couple spent recklessly and fell into debt. Frédéric's father, now climbing toward the Ministry of Justice, quietly paid their creditors to avoid scandal. Thérèse watched closely. She saw that lenders forgave anything when repayment looked certain. Reputation, she realized, was a currency she could print. Then, around 1879, she unveiled the story that would make her famous. On a train, she said, she had come to the aid of a stricken American, Robert Henry Crawford, as a heart attack seized him. He survived the journey, and when he died soon after, his will named the young Frenchwoman who had saved him. By 1881, she was producing letters announcing Crawford's death and her place in his estate, and her father-in-law's standing lent the tale credibility. The figure attached to it was staggering, 100 million francs. In the money of the day, with the franc trading at roughly 5 to the American dollar, that was about $20 million, a fortune large enough to make a washerwoman's daughter one of the richest women in France, at least on paper. To formalize the lie, 2 wills were eventually forged, both dated the 6th of September, 1877. But the fortune came wrapped in conditions. The will, she said, was contested by Crawford's nephews. Until the dispute was settled, the bonds and securities had to remain locked away, untouched, in a single sealed safe. She had built herself the perfect excuse never to open it. The treasure had to stay hidden to stay safe. She installed the safe in her home on the Avenue de la Grande Armée and hired a magistrate to act as notary. Documents and securities were placed inside. The door was shut, and the seam was sealed with hot wax. An officer of the law had certified the ritual. To every banker who heard of it, the safe was now a fact. The first loans came quickly. As early as 1881, the Crédit Foncier advanced nearly £1 million against the promise of the estate. Other lenders followed, certain the 100 million behind the iron door would soon repay them many times over. In the early years alone, the Humberts borrowed on the order of 50 million francs, buying mansions and a steam yacht, borrowing against a future that did not exist, and spending the proceeds as though it already had. With borrowed money, the rise was breathtaking. Country mansions, a steam yacht, a newspaper of her own to shape opinion, a salon that drew ministers, financiers, and the most powerful names of the Third Republic. Thérèse Humbert became one of the most courted hostesses in France, the keeper of a fortune everyone could speak of and no one could see. Even a former empress, Eugenie, and figures close to the presidency were said to have entered her orbit. The more lavishly she spent, the more real the 100 million appeared. Her father-in-law had become Minister of Justice, and his name hung over the whole enterprise like a guarantee. Who would dare accuse the daughter-in-law of the man who held the seals of France? Doubt began to feel not just rude, but dangerous. The fraud was protected by the very institutions it was robbing. To keep the legend alive, she needed the dispute over the will to look real. So her own brothers stepped into the roles of the Crawford heirs. Romain and Émile d'Aurignac became the foreign claimants, sending lawyers, lodging objections, demanding their share. The fight over the fortune was entirely staged, performed by the family. The staged lawsuits moved through real French courts. In 1884, the phantom nephews demanded a 6 million franc indemnity. In October 1885, Therese sued them in return. Genuine judges heard the case, weighed the two forged wills, and issued real rulings, each one quietly cementing the belief that the Crawford fortune existed. The litigation became a weapon. As long as the heirs were fighting, the safe could not be opened, and the loans could keep flowing. In January 1890, a court ruled in Therese's favor. 2 years later, in January 1892, the Cour de Cassation, the highest court in France, rejected the appeal against her. The Supreme Court of the nation had, in effect, certified a fiction. There was now no stronger proof of the inheritance than the law itself. Now the machine could run at full speed. Each new loan was justified by the same locked door. Old debts were paid with fresh borrowing, and fresh borrowing was secured by a fortune no one had ever counted. It was a pyramid of credit, and at its base sat a single sealed safe nobody was permitted to open. The interest was brutal. Some lenders charged as much as 60%, gambling that the 100 million would make them all whole. Every punishing rate only deepened the trap, because each loan had to be serviced by another. The faster the money moved, the larger the hole grew beneath it. To reach beyond the bankers, Therese turned to ordinary savers. She built a life insurance and annuity venture, the Rent Viager, promising security to peasants, shopkeepers, and clerks. Its glossy prospectus paraded grand and unauthorized endorsements, and the modest deposits poured in, but there were no reserves. Money from new subscribers simply paid older claims, while most of it flowed straight into her own accounts, used not to protect anyone's old age, but to feed the debts of the rich. The scale became almost impossible to measure. Newspapers reported sums anywhere from 20 million to 250 million francs. Later scholars estimate that, across 2 decades, something close to 700 million francs in loans and interest passed through her hands, of which roughly 100 million she kept for herself. Not everyone was fooled. As early as 1883, the newspaper Le Matin had questioned whether any American named Crawford had ever existed. No one could produce an address. No one had truly met the heirs. But each time doubt surfaced, the minister's name and the court's rulings buried it again. A Bank of France official named Jules Bizat decided to check her claims directly. Thérèse had always insisted her wealth sat safely in French government bonds, the rents that any honest fortune would hold. Bizat searched the registers and found nothing. She had never bought a single one. The securities she pledged to her lenders were, like the man on the train, entirely imaginary, conjured words on paper backed by more paper. The warnings turned to ruin among her lenders. A banker named Gerard, in the town of Elbeuf, had poured enormous sums into the Humbert fortune. When the money would not come back, he was destroyed. By several accounts, Gerard took his own life. His death forced the authorities to finally look behind the curtain. By 1901, the dam broke. Creditors who had waited 20 years for their 100 million ran out of patience and sued. The litigation that had always protected the safe now turned against it. For the first time, a French court began to ask the one question Thérèse had spent her whole career avoiding: what was actually inside? Her reach had touched the highest places in France. Among the creditors were the Crédit Foncier, the Crédit Industriel of Paris, the Banca Catani, and by some accounts, even the Bank of France itself. Aristocrats, financiers, and figures close to the Republic's leaders had all staked their money on the locked door. But she had also bled the poor. Working-class Parisians had handed her their retirement savings. Country tradespeople had mortgaged everything they owned. The same affair that humiliated bankers quietly wiped out thousands of small families who would never see a centime of it again. The fortune was a fiction, the ruin was real. The scandal even seeped into the world of art. Among the families said to be ruined were the in-laws of a young, then unknown painter named Henri Matisse. The Humbert affair did not just topple financiers. It reached into ordinary households whose only crime was believing in a treasure they had never seen. Then came the order no excuse could stop. On the 9th of May, 1902, a Paris court directed that the famous coffer be opened. The press had already named it the Coffre-Fort des Cent Millions, the safe of 100 million. A vast crowd, by some accounts approaching 10,000 people, pressed in to witness the moment the great fortune of France was finally revealed. After 20 years of rumor, the door would speak for itself. Officials broke the wax and swung the iron door wide. There was no fortune, no bonds, no securities, no gold. Inside the safe of 100 million they found a brick, a single coin, a trouser button, an old newspaper clipping, and a handful of worthless papers, including promissory notes the Humberts had signed to themselves. After 20 years, the treasure of France turned out to be the chest of her childhood all over again, a worthless object that had ruled men's minds only because no one was permitted to look. Thérèse already knew what the safe contained because she had filled it. Days before the door was forced, the Humberts vanished from Paris. The hostess of the Republic, the woman whose name had opened every drawing room in France, slipped out of the country ahead of the scandal that her own iron door was about to unleash. France erupted. For weeks, the affair filled every front page, rivaling even the Dreyfus scandal for the nation's attention. Caricaturists mocked the empty coffer. The safe of 100 million became a national joke and a national wound at the same time. And still, the Humberts could not be found. The trail finally led across the Pyrenees to Spain. On the 20th of December, 1902, police arrested Thérèse, her husband Frédéric, and her brothers in Madrid, where the family had been hiding in plain sight, said to have even watched the coronation festivities for the young King Alfonso while police across Europe hunted them. The Grande Thérèse was extradited back to Paris to face the creditors she had ruined. In January 1903, the newspapers showed the family being marched back into the capital. The illustrated weeklies splashed their arrival across the covers. The fallen aristocrats of fraud paraded before a public hungry for a reckoning. The empire of credit had become a procession of prisoners. The trial opened on the 8th of August, 1903, before the Assize Court of the Seine and ran for roughly 2 weeks. Paris was transfixed. Thérèse, defended by the celebrated advocate Maître Henry Robert, fought to the last, still insisting the Crawfords had been real, that a true fortune had slipped through her fingers. She never confessed, and to the end she played the wronged heiress rather than the swindler. The verdict came at the end of August. Thérèse Humbert was sentenced to 5 years. Her husband Frédéric received 5 years as well. Her brother Romain, who had played a Crawford heir, was given 3 years. Her brother Emile, too. The Prime Minister, Waldeck Crouseau, called it the greatest swindle of the century. 5 years seemed a small price for 2 decades and hundreds of millions of francs, yet the deeper sentence was never served in any cell. The thousands of small savers and provincial families she had drained were never repaid, and most stayed silent out of shame at having been fooled. Many had handed her everything they owned, mortgaging farms and emptying savings, and walked away with exactly what the safe had held: nothing. After her release, Thérèse Humbert disappeared from history almost as quietly as her fictional millionaire had appeared in it. Most accounts say she sailed for America and died in obscurity in Chicago in 1918, far from the salons she had once ruled, though a few sources insist she lived on quietly in Paris into old age. Either way, the woman who built an empire on an empty box ended her life with one. Her father had taught her that a brick could pass for a fortune if no one ever opened the chest. Therese Humbert proved him right on a scale he never imagined, and then proved him wrong the moment the door swung open. The lesson of the empty safe endures. Any treasure you are never allowed to see may not be a treasure at all.